Daniel, you can introduce us. I see your mic is muted on your end, Daniel. Good evening, guys. We've got a little bit of a technical issue. There we go.
Good evening to all our viewers. Good evening to all our viewers, both here in South Africa and Western nations abroad. Tonight I'm joined by fellow Vryburger, Johannes and leader of the Vryburger movement. This evening we have a very special guest with us, Mr. Jared Taylor. Mr. Taylor is an author, activist, and really an all-round white moralizer in a world that is hostile towards whites and hell-bent on demoralizing us out of existence. He runs AMREN, or the American Renaissance Institute, along with his colleagues, Mr. Hood and Mr. Wolf, and has been involved in the pro-white political sphere for many years. Welcome, Mr. Taylor, and thank you for joining us this evening.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me.
Johannes,
it's a pleasure to speak with you.
Yeah.
Absolutely, sir. We do apologize if there is a little bit of a latency.
Johannes, anything to add from your side before we start?
Absolutely. We would just like to say, again, from my side, it's a great honor to be joined with you, Mr. Jared, because as you can imagine, you are an inspiration for thousands of young men around the world that are engaged in the white, racial conscious politics. So it's a great honor, and we very much look forward to the conversation that we will be having.
Well, I must say that it is very flattering when young men tell me that I've been an inspiration. But I always say to them, and I say to you, you people are a great inspiration to me. Because when I first started doing this 35 years ago, there were so few people among our race, especially young people, who understood the terrible challenges that we face. And over the years, that number has grown. And I am so impressed with the quality and the commitment of young men and women who are joining our movement. So again, it's very kind of you to call me an inspiration, but the greatest inspiration I have today is seeing the number and the quality and the dedication of the young people who are joining our movement now. It's really a wonderful thing.
Absolutely.
Okay, Mr. Taylor, we'll get into the questions we have for you this evening.
Certainly.
So I think more so than most whites out there, you have a great level of knowledge and experience about the anti-white agenda and how it has played out both here in South Africa as well as in the West in general. Could you perhaps tell us what similarities you see between the South African situation over the last 30 to 40 years and the rest of the white Western nations in the world today?
Well, the greatest similarity is the extent to which we Western nations have brought these terrible problems upon ourselves. White nations certainly had the power to resist, certainly, at the time of the end of the Second World War, even before. If the white nations had wanted to, they could have completely dominated and exploited the world. But white nations decolonized, and then the white nations that had been former colonial countries, colonial metropolitan nations, they made the terrible, foolish mistake of letting some of their colonized people into their own countries, not just some of them, but in very large numbers. It's a matter of will, not capacity. And people have speculated at great length as to what went wrong for white people. Because certainly 100 years ago, or maybe up until about the time of the First World War, white people were confident. White people knew that they were the carriers of civilization, and they had no hesitancy about taking that civilization beyond their borders. And now white people are browbeaten, they are intimidated, they are terrified, and they think that everything that whites have done throughout the century, throughout the millennia, is a terrible thing to be apologized for. People have many theories as to why that's so. And some people blame Christianity. Some people blame the influence of Jews. Some people blame the fact of those 2 world wars, 2 terrible, fratricidal, horrible butcheries of white people killing each other that left white people demoralized. I'm not sure every one of them, I'm not sure all of those things, even put together, really explain this sudden denaturing of white people. The loss among white people of the ability to do the most natural and normal thing, and that is to stand up for their own people, to fight for their own survival. This has characterized all people, including whites, all throughout history, really. And it is unprecedented, utterly unprecedented in history, that nations that had the power to maintain their majority, and even in the case of South Africa, to maintain a dominance in a country where they were not the majority, voluntarily to give up power and to turn it over to people who are not only unlike themselves, but who ultimately will seek revenge, who will seek to dominate in ways that will be terrifying and very, very ultimately, perhaps even existentially a threat to the whites who were once in control of those nations. So 2 things, these processes have been going on in the same way, both in South Africa and really all white nations, with the exception of those that are beyond what we used to call the Iron Curtain. Eastern European countries, they were protected from the terrible poisons, the ideological poisons of the West for the entire period of Soviet domination. And for that reason, I believe that they still have a kind of instinctive loyalty to their own peoplehood, their own nationhood, something that so many people in the West have lost. Of course, the stakes for white South Africans were always higher. It was the same, of course, for the people of Zimbabwe. Those of you whites who colonized and became the white tribes in Africa, you have always been a small minority, and therefore you faced the most terrifying risks if power were to slip out of your hands and to fall into the hands of people who resent you and who in many cases hate you and in fact want you dead. So South Africa and Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe of course, you are special cases of the kind of demographic and then ultimately civilizational threat that whites face all around the world. Of course, in the case of South Africa, I believe your capitulation goes back to that 1992 referendum in which white South Africans voted. As I recall, the wording of this referendum was a very strange and confusing one. And it was not really as clear as saying, okay, do you want to turn your country over to blacks? It was something about, do you want to continue this negotiation process, blah, 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 blah. It said nothing about the fate that awaited the white South Africans. But in any case, in every situation in which we see whites threatened demographically by non-whites whom they have let into their countries, it is a failure of will, and it is not a lack of the power to prevent this. So what we need to do, of course, is rekindle this ancient sense of peoplehood that has driven people of our civilization to great heights throughout the millennia. We need to rebuild this, and I see this process as moving forward much more rapidly today than it was even just 5 or 10 years ago. And certainly this seemed to be almost at a standstill 35 years ago when I first started American Renaissance.
Thank you very much, Mr. Taylor. So there are some people in the audience that say that your mic levels are a little low. Now, I've tried adjusting on my end your microphone volume. So if you could, if there's something that you can do to increase the volume on your end.
I can move the microphone closer and I can increase the gain. Let's see what I can do here. Let's see.
That already sounds a little bit better. I must say, Mr. Taylor, I am not at all surprised, but all the same, still impressed at your knowledge on South African history. Because yes, indeed, you know, many people so often say that we willingly handed over power to the black majority, and I try to stay away from terms such as black majority and minority for a very specific reason, because this country does belong to us, regardless of who the majority of people that are residing in it. And we must always emphasize the importance of white nationhood and the right to white nationhood when it comes pertaining to our countries, especially South Africa. But the thing about the referendum was, you're exactly right. They only voted to continue the negotiations. Never was it said that they voted to give the country to blacks. And there was large-scale collusion, I hope that's the right word, as well as coercion in forcing the general populace into accepting this, where many people were jailed and violently persecuted, that tried to prevent this government, our country, from falling into the hands of a black government. So it is very enlightening to hear a person such as yourself express these, intricacies in our politics. So yeah.
Well, of course, I think the majority of the blame lies with white people all around the world, everywhere, led by the United States, the Europeans, particularly the Scandinavians. At the time, there was an absolute concerted worldwide effort to strangle the Afrikaner nation in its crib, to destroy it, to turn it over to people who would hate it, who would pillage it, who would exploit it. This is, I think, one of the great international crimes of our century. The more I learn about the Afrikaners, the more I admire them as a people. They developed a civilization of their own with its own characteristics, your own distinctive language, your own culture, your own heritage, your own heroes, your own history. It's a glorious history. And for your fellow whites all around the planet to have joined together to say, no, what you're doing is terrible. This was a cruel, this was an unforgivable thing. And you were a victim of a kind of strange movement, a strange psychological movement among whites. And of course, it infected you to some degree. Of course, the South Africans resisted these movements into the 1990s, which was certainly far different from the United States. We started integrating and trying to pretend that diversity was a strength. We started doing this in the 1950s and 1960s. Instinctively, the people, the whites who lived in Africa, understood that this was a suicidal thing. It was only after we had persecuted you, we'd insulted you, we browbeated you, we excluded you from sporting competitions, and I know this was an important element as well, the fact that you couldn't play international rugby. All of these things were combined together to, and as you say, there was this skullduggery among your own leaders and your own media figures to kind of hide the effect of what this referendum was going to do, which then put you in the hands of blacks, and now we can look back and see that the wise Afrikaners among you who said, this is terrible, this will be suicide, you are absolutely 100% correct. But now it has become much, much more difficult to salvage some kind of Afrikaner statehood or white statehood. And I speak of Afrikaners because I think the English speaking whites in South Africa, I think some of them are wide awake white people, genuine South African patriots, but it was really the Afrikaners, the Boers, who were the backbone, the heart and the soul of your country. And again, to have massacred your nationhood after all of the heroic struggles for independence, not only fighting against Africans when need be, but against the British, and two struggles of really heroic stature of your people against this kind of imperial exploitative outsiders. You really are a heroic people, and to have capitulated in this way is really one of the, I believe, history's great tragedies.
Well, Mr. Taylor, I do thank you for your kind words towards our people, and welcome back, Daniel. We do have South African substandard internet. It's no longer white internet, so that's why it's not so fully functional. But yes, Mr. Taylor, I would like to say our leaders did capitulate, but all is not lost. That heroic spirit in my people still lives on to this day. And the testimony to that is the fact that we refuse, even amidst the fact that Donald Trump has given us asylum status. My people will never ever leave this country, because you cannot sign away with ink that which was bought with blood, and my people pay too dearly. We believe that yes, the world did turn its back on South Africa and they did condemn us, and growing up there was a feeling of resentment. But now, as our understanding in the world and in terms of geopolitics has grown, in terms
apologies. Can you guys?
Hello, Daniel. We can hear you. So Daniel is experiencing some technical issues, and we do apologize for that. But now, as our knowledge and our understanding of the importance of racial collectivism has grown, we believe that we have gotten a divine appointment in terms of the greater white collective to stand our ground in South Africa and to proclaim that South Africa is for the white man and that we will never ever leave this country. And this is not a sentiment expressed by myself alone in some vacuum or in some dark corner of South Africa. This is a message that lives in the hearts of almost every one of my countrymen, and even those that are liberal. They have got this same almost sort of genetic memory, sort of a blood memory that lives in them. They just do not know how to articulate yet this feeling. They do not understand why it is that they are bound to South Africa and that they do not want to leave this country. But I can promise you, Mr. Taylor, the Afrikaner people are here to stay. And I believe that what we will do in this country will inspire the Europeans around the world to not turn their backs and capitulate, but to propagate forward towards white nationhood and white sovereignty all around the world. So yeah, I just wanted to say that.
I certainly hope that is true, and from the bottom of my heart, I wish you every success. I can't remember what the year was when the first Dutchman started a colony in the Cape, 1624 or something like that.
1652.
52. That's only a few years, really, after the first English settlement in Virginia in 1607. Your people have been in South Africa almost as long as my people have been in North America. Yes, it is very much your country. And when I first heard about this idea of granting asylum to South Africans, I thought to myself, well, that is an understandable recognition of the terrible oppression and discrimination that you face. On the other hand, I don't want the South African nation, the potential white South African nation, to be bled of its people. Of course, there are many hardships that you face, but I hope that you are 100% correct and that you can overcome those hardships. There has to be a nation that maintains the Voortrekker Monument, for example, and that celebrates the Day of the Vow, and that maintains that wonderful monument at where the Battle of Blood River took place. All of those were footsteps forward in your development as a European nation that was planted in the southern part of Africa. And I think that it would be terrible if all of those great people then were disappeared and were swallowed up in the kind of homogenizing nature of the United States of America. I believe all white people have much in common, but at the same time, our distinctions are so very important. And it would be terrible if all of the wonderful Afrikaner traditions, the religious celebrations, and the kind of food that you have, all of your folklore and songs, all of that to be swallowed up in a kind of homogeneous North America. Perhaps one of the reasons that I'm especially sympathetic to the Afrikaners is that when I see photographs of the commandos that fought against the British during the Boer War, those brave, handsome, stalwart, solid men, they remind me of my Confederate ancestors. They look just like the photographs of Confederates. And I see a real kinship, a real fellowship among those people who fought against an overwhelming power, really first-rate soldiers who were ground down only by superior numbers and greater technology. Perhaps that's one of the origins of my feeling of deep kinship with South Africans. Hello?
Daniel, so I just want to give Daniel an opportunity to speak, sir. That's the only reason that I am a bit quiet.
Daniel, let's hear from you. No, I think you must have internet.
Yeah, my audio keeps cutting out. I'm struggling to keep up with the conversation. My signal seems to be dipping.
I might just add this. So there's this little book.
I just want to go ahead with the questions because I'm struggling to follow the conversation.
Oh, that's
you can go ahead with your questions, Daniel. Daniel, can you hear us?
Okay, can you guys hear me? Yes, see, I'm struggling to hear you guys. So if I don't respond, it's because I'm not getting in. Johannes, I'm not sure if you want to continue with the questions. I can't follow the conversation really on my side due to the internet being so bad.
Can you just send me the questions on Telegram, please? And I will say this is probably my hero in terms of Afrikaner history. So, this guy was the guy that formulated, along with General Hertzog and Hans Strijdom and so on, the apartheid model, the separate development model. And he wrote a book in which it's called
Well, now I can't hear you either.
That'll be a problem. Hello? Are you there?
Yes. I'm here. I could not hear you for a while there. You disappeared.
Yes, we've got a pretty thunderstorm, which is night. Tonight's a good night. Speaking with Mr. Taylor, as well as receiving some long-awaited rain. But this guy, he was named Dani D.F. Malan, Dani Malan, a great inspiration in terms of politics for the Afrikaner people. In 1910, Alfred Milner famously it turned South Africa into a union, thereby abolishing all the borders that naturally separated the people in South Africa that my people fought so hard to obtain. So that's why we say South Africa was a white country, because prior to 1910, we were racially segregated, even before apartheid was a concept. Now, this guy, along with Hertzog, they engineered the separate development program, which was really nothing other than a peaceful resettling or an attempt to peacefully repatriate all the different people that had been forced together. But there is this beautiful quote that he said in a Day of the Vow speech, when you said just now about the Afrikaner tradition. And he said, it has long been said that the history of South Africa is a tragedy and should be forgotten to enable us to focus on the more pressing matters. Our history is not a tragedy. It is nothing other than the highest artwork of the ages. We have the right to nationhood because we were given the right to nationhood by the architect of the universe. So there's just a little beautiful quote that he gave to inspire the youth. And he specifically said, I lay this because our task as a nation is not yet complete. And this will probably be just as relevant in 100 years from now as it is today. And here we are 100 years later, and his words still hold true. We have the right to be a nation. We have a higher calling to be a nation, and we will not be forgotten. We will fight to remain a nation. But yeah, so I asked Daniel to send me those questions. I'm going to move on to the second one just so that we can keep the conversation nice and flowing. So now we are sure that you have heard about the recent expropriation bill that has been passed in South Africa and have seen President Trump's response to this bill. What would your opinion be on both the bill itself and the offer of refugee status to the Afrikaners in the United States? I think you already did answer that, but
Yes,
go ahead,
yes,
please.
yes. Of course, this problem of land seizures is a terrible one, and that's what destroyed Rhodesia. All of those very productive farms that were run by whites and had been in their families for generations, taken over by blacks who let them go completely to seed. It was a terrible thing, of course, for the whites, but ended up being a terrible thing for the nation at large. And now we have these terrible killings of white farmers in South Africa, and the world at large turns its back on all of this. It is we are replaying this horrible procedure whereby so many white countries betrayed the white South Africans, who were the only people running a successful country south of the Sahara Desert. In fact, in the entire continent of Africa, because all you're comparing with is places like Algeria or Egypt. This is an inevitability. Every time after colonization, when blacks took over power, whether it was in Ghana or Ivory Coast or Benin or in Uganda, Mozambique, wherever it happened, then life became worse for everyone who was living in those countries. And in the case of those countries that were run by substantial minorities of whites, then the blacks turned on the whites, certainly in Rhodesia, in the most vicious and horrible and bloody way, and drove them out. And now they are living in terrible poverty. I often hear about blacks who are living in South Africa who would say life was better when white men ran the country. And apparently, there seems to be a kind of almost schizophrenic mentality among many blacks in South Africa. And that is to say, from a kind of intellectual point of view, they recognize that it was better when whites were in charge, that whites were more fair, that whites established a kind of rule of law, that everything worked better under whites. On the other hand, at the same time, they take a kind of visceral pride in black rule. And this seems to be a contradiction that is a very difficult thing for some blacks to reconcile. There are, of course, some professional blacks who are in government or who work for NGOs who would never admit that South Africa was a better functioning country when whites ran it. But then I would think that a large number of ordinary black people who were alive, who were living at the time of white rule, they recognize what has been lost. But the question of how South Africa, what a once again white-run South Africa would look like, this is something that is not always easy for the rest of us to imagine or understand. I mean, what would you do? What would you do with these millions of black people who live in South Africa? Of course, you have many who are illegal immigrants. And that was always such a hilarious thing, even under white rule. So many blacks were trying to sneak into South Africa from all around Africa because living under white rule was so much better than living under black rule in some neighboring country. Of course, this is something that the Western media always ignored. We always criticized the whites for dominating the larger number of blacks who were a majority, and never considering the fact that under white rule, black lives were so much better that people came by the millions from outside of South Africa to submit to what was this allegedly horrible experience of being run by white people. And of course, even now, 30 years since the handover to the blacks, South Africa, even because it still has this large number of whites who are so much more competent than Africans, it's still a better place to live than in the neighboring countries. But what a rejuvenated South Africa would look like, I'm sure you must have some idea in your mind as to what the structure, the political or demographic structure of a rejuvenated white Africa would be, of white-run South Africa would be. And although I understand that it's my job to answer questions and not ask them, perhaps I could trouble you to sketch out in your mind what a rejuvenated South Africa would look like.
Oh, absolutely. That's a great, I'm honored that you would ask that, Mr. Taylor. So I think that it is as my dad always taught me. I'm a farmer, son of a farmer, for 7 generations now. And he always says it's not necessary to tamper with an idea that works. Now, obviously, the apartheid model, there were flaws in it, especially in that there was a very large meddling from the private sector in South Africa. Actually, a very big undermining that is actually what is happening today is the private sector, I believe, engineered the fall of apartheid. And there's many source material that you can use to, staff this theory that I have. But if it were to run its course and the people would have been repatriated to their natural homes where they were originally from, and white people were allowed to develop the country, then I think we would have had an absolutely amazing country. Because towards the latter part of apartheid, 65% of white taxpayer money was used to develop infrastructure in the homelands, or the Thuislande, as it was called. Now, to answer the question, just to give a little bit of a foundation for the answer, I believe, and we believe as a movement, that you cannot be a nation if you do not have a fatherland, if you do not have a country which is sovereign and which is ruled by your people, by your values, but on a racial level, not to have your people be reduced to a value system alone so that anybody can join in that value system, but to say, hey, these value systems were sprouted from the fact that we are of European descent. So we believe that if we were to one day assume control of what is rightfully ours, just to word it like that, as you can obviously imagine the implications of wording it otherwise, I would say that our very first focus would be to develop the rural countryside, to do away with the big metropoles and reduce it in size, for we believe it to be an enemy of our identity and culture. And before the Anglo-Boer War, the Boers had about 90% of us lived on the rural countryside. Then after the Anglo-Boer War, with the implementation of the scorched earth, and this is from the Farmers Weekly 100 years edition, 48% of the white population remained on the rural countryside. Today, it is 28%. So we believe to invigorate the national spirit, we must resettle and develop the rural countryside, build into our culture as a people, to develop especially agriculture, to nationalize the mining sector, so that the fruits and the resources helps to develop our people.
Well, of course, the question then becomes, what do you do with all those millions of blacks? I know that under apartheid, it was not just what's known as petty apartheid, but you had grand apartheids, that you had the homelands, both Botswana and Transkei and Ciskei, those various places. But now there's such an enormous black population that even if you are able to expel all the illegal immigrants in South Africa, it's not practical to fit all of the remaining blacks into those homelands. And for whites to have a sovereign nation, I'm afraid you will still have to have a certain number of blacks and coloreds, and you'll have to deal with them in some realistic way. Is there any plan in mind for that? It would be, of course, it's a much, much more difficult undertaking now to reverse all of these decades of damage, whereas something might have been possible while you were still in power, to arrange things in such a way that despite a certain amount of opprobrium and opposition from the rest of the world, you could argue that, well, blacks are being treated in a way that makes sense, and we have maintained our sovereignty in our homelands. But certainly for world opinion, you're going to have some sort of plan for the blacks of South Africa.
Absolutely. So just to put it into context for people to understand what the demographics looked like back in during the Anglo-Boer War, there was about 4 million blacks in South Africa. And when white people started with the separate development program, that population boomed into 14 million by the time that we handed over power. Today, it is estimated. And I say estimated because anybody that would trust what Statistics South Africa said is a brazen madman. And, so it is estimated that there is 46 million blacks living in South Africa today. So the majority of black people, by far the majority of black people that live in South Africa are not from here and are foreign invaders. And I believe that this is a very profound question, Mr. Taylor, that I think that it is not one that South Africa is to answer in and of itself, but it's more so a question that we as white people need to collectively find an answer for, because you are faced with exactly the same challenges in America. Right now, the American population, the majority status of the whites has significantly, been reduced. So now you sit also with a bunch of people that do not belong in your country, and you have to find an answer for that. Now, I can let my imagination run absolutely wild with what could be, in my mind, very justified answers to this demographic challenge. But what I would say is that we have to look at, first and foremostly, I don't believe in the politics of the obtainable. I think what made us as a race such a great people is the fact that we never pursued the obtainable. When my forefathers came here and built a halfway station in 1652, there was only a 1 in 3 chance that you could survive that journey. So only out of 3 people that came, only 1 survived. So I think it is first and foremostly the answer begins with reinvigorating a different kind of spiritual approach among white people. I'm not talking about religion, I'm talking about what we set our minds to and what we believe is possible. To not think reclusively, to not think of what other people would allow us to do. Because the fact is, Mr. Taylor, that the people that have come to our countries that do not belong here won't allow us even to have a small town such as Orania. You see this to this very day. They say, we're going to destroy Orania. We're coming for Orania. We're going to take Orania. So they do not respect our altruism. They do not respect our kind-heartedness. So I think the answer begins, at least, with a reinvigorated spirit of conquest among the youth. Is that acceptable as an answer for you, or would you like me to elaborate further?
No. I have always said that the racial question in the United States is one that will be solved when more people, more white people, are consciously aware of the threat that they face and are committed to removing this threat. And then the actual form of the solution to the racial problem, how the races will separate and in what manner, because I believe that the survival of whites in North America requires separation. What the practical modalities of this question are, I cannot predict, but I'm confident that if enough white people are determined to ensure their survival by means of separation, then some way will be found. And let us hope that the same is true in South Africa. It's a matter of white people rekindling the spirit of their ancestors and rekindling this basic fundamental commitment to the survival of their own people.
Absolutely, sir. So I always say to my people, we as a movement started exactly because we desire to see leadership. And we are so, tired of not seeing strong and decisive leadership. So we say, firstly, awaken, then rebuild, and then free our people. So those are the goals. It must be simple. It can't be complicated, because the more complex it is, the harder it is to implement. Now, same goes for America, I do believe. And I tell them that we must now unify our people around the message that South Africa does belong to us, that we must acknowledge this. Because if we start saying that apartheid, if we cave to the demands of our enemies, let's say that apartheid was a human rights violation and it was an atrocity, etc., then we are setting the stage for future political discourse. And that is not good. I think we must stand up for ourselves and say, hey, we are not outcome-based. We are values-based. We've got very strong values, and one of those values is the truth. And we will rally our people behind that. That's why we will rally them behind the national sentiment. And from there, we can discuss the second phase of our solution. But we shouldn't, I think, intimidate our people with the gravity of the situation by running too far ahead. Let's take this step by step and awaken white people to the I do apologize, Mr. Taylor. Direness. Thank you very much. Direness of the situation, and rallying them behind something simple, such as our identity.
Well, very good. Very good. No, it's the same in the United States. The first step is to awaken white people not only to the necessity of ensuring their survival, but the fact that it is a moral and healthy and good thing. The astonishing thing about white people, it seems practically in the entire West, is that they have been somehow brainwashed and browbeaten into thinking that taking the most minimal and obvious steps to ensure their own survival is somehow immoral. This is a completely topsy-turvy, inside-out, upside-down way to view morality. Morality and survival. Survival is the first law, and we must do what is necessary to ensure our survival.
Very well put, Mr. Taylor, I must say. So I'm going to continue. There's only 6 questions, so we are at point 3. So as you well know, up until now, DEI policies and affirmative action policies have become more and more prevalent in Western nations. Since South Africa is a sort of canary in the coal mine. Do you believe that as the demographics of many Western nations shifts to the minority white, what expropriation of private property might also be that expropriation of private property might also be implemented in these countries in the near future?
Well, first of all, it is vital to prevent the reduction of whites to a minority status. In the United States, we are already very far down along this road. And even if it were possible to stop immigration tomorrow, and if Donald Trump can't stop it, I don't know what president will be able to stop it. Even if immigration were to stop tomorrow, simply because of differential birth rates, whites will become a minority in the present territorial bounds of the United States of America. I don't think that that is inevitable in most of Western European countries. France has a large number of Muslims. Britain has a large number of ex-colonial subjects. But if immigration of those people were to stop tomorrow, I believe that the white majorities could be maintained for a very long time. And with enough energy put into a process of remigration, then I don't think that Western European countries need face the prospect of being an actual numerical minority, which is already your fate and potentially our fate. So the number one struggle to me is to, first of all, completely end any kind of non-white immigration into white countries. And to me, it is wonderful that when our Vice President, J.D. Vance, went to Europe and spoke at a conference in Munich that is supposed to be about security, he said, look, you people are here to talk about weapons and armies. I'm here to tell you that the greatest threat to your security is migration. This was a wonderful thing. For years, for decades, the United States has been pumping these horrible ideological poisons about diversity being a strength and we're all the same and race is a myth, all of this foolishness. We have been the source of a tremendous amount of evil that has polluted the minds of whites all around the world. And for a vice president of the United States to go to Europe and say, your number one security problem is immigration. He's not saying non-white immigration, but he might as well be. This is a tremendous leap forward. So with perhaps the encouragement of the United States, then I hope and believe that European nations really will finally take their borders seriously, finally take their responsibility to their next generation and the generation after that, take that responsibility seriously and stop all of this non-European immigration. So that is the number one step. The number one thing white people have to do is to stop non-whites coming into their countries. And if whites can maintain a numerical majority in Western Europe, as they have certainly done so in Eastern Europe, then they will not face the kinds of rampaging and rampant anti-white policies that you face in South Africa and which, astonishingly enough, Americans implemented while they were still the majority people. As I said before, the United States has spent the last several decades being a terrible example and encouraging bad examples, spreading these suicidal ideas all around the world. And for that to have stopped because of one election in the United States is really a tremendous, tremendous achievement. Now, how to go about it in South Africa is a much more difficult problem because, as I said, you are already a minority. Another consideration, of course, is that if Britain and France were to lose their white majorities, or if this were to happen in Germany, the ones that would be taking their place would not be almost exclusively blacks, as is the problem in South Africa. Blacks, wherever you find them, create a kind of misery and degeneracy that is not equaled by any other non-white group. So if there is a reduction of whites to a minority in the United States, it will not be because of overwhelming numbers of blacks. It will be overwhelming numbers of Hispanics, that is to say, mestizos from Latin America, also Asians, a certain number of subcontinental Indians, I certainly do not want to be replaced by any of these people. But the kind of majority that they would establish in a majority non-white United States is not quite as mortal a threat to civilization as the black majority you face in South Africa and as is the case in Zimbabwe. So you have a particularly difficult position. You're in a particularly difficult position. And so it is true that you are canaries in the coal mine to the extent that here you are, a once dominant white population that is now a minority. And not just a minority, but a relatively small minority. And not just a minority, but a minority that is dominated by a black and African majority. You're talking about people with an estimated IQ of 75 or 80 or something like that. It is an absolute horror for your destiny to be in the hands of such people. At least in the United States, most American blacks have enough admixture of white so that they have an average IQ of 85, which is considerably higher than the black sub-Saharan African IQ. This makes a huge difference. But so again, your problems are unique. And much as it is flattering to be asked, what is my opinion as to how South Africa or ex-Rhodesia can survive as European nations, it is you who will have to come up with those solutions because you face unique challenges that no other white group faces.
Yeah, that's a great answer, Mr. Taylor. I do fear for the for the European people in particular, because my dad always told me this story. He said, the apartheid military, so it's going to go into too much of a complex and nuanced discussion, but the people that were at the beheads of the military and government when we fought in the Bush War were very evil people, very bad people, people that were not very pro-white, that actually committed themselves to the world.
I'm sorry, what do you mean by the Bush War? Are you talking about in Rhodesia?
Yeah, I mean the border war. So we in Afrikaans we say Bosoorlog, which is Bush War, but yeah, so the border war in which we fought in Angola,
Yes,
as a proxy for the United States. He said the thing that was always perplexing to him when they would encounter these black tribes, the women would be dragging their newborn children through cow dung and such stuff like that. And the military would show up and say, whoa, don't do this. We're going to build you clinics and we are going to teach you how to be healthy. And the South African military, the apartheid military, actually helped establish healthcare networks for the people that they invaded. And this has been a trend that has been more and more occurring throughout Europe with NGOs such as Doctors Without Borders. And what we have seen as a result of that is an absolute boom of the African population. Now, what worries me is that if I were to be some malicious force in the world that didn't like Europeans, that didn't like white people, and I had this neighboring continent with 2 billion blacks, whether it be natural or whether it be manufactured, if a famine, I apologize, I have to use all my, thinking capacity to grasp the words, but if a famine were to occur in Africa, then Europe would be completely in the most vulnerable position to billions of black people flooding it. So the European people, we are in a dire situation, but Europe really, really needs to get a hold of itself and secure its borders, because Africa is a ticking time bomb for Europe, for mainland Europe.
Oh, there's no question about this. I just finished making a video, and it's available on the American Renaissance website, amran.com. But it's about American aid to Africa. And at the conclusion of this video, I show a graph. And some people have called this graph the most important graph in the world at this point. And it shows the astonishing rise of African populations. In 1950, that's just 1 year before I was born, there were only half as many people on the entire continent of Africa as there were in Europe at that time. Now there are twice as many Africans as there are Europeans. And by the end of the century, there could be 4, 5, 6, 8 times as many Africans as there are Europeans. And as you know, Africans are not very good at providing for their own means of subsistence. And those billions of Africans are, having made a wreck of their own continent, are going to want to swarm across the Mediterranean or across the Atlantic, anywhere, to get away from their own continent and live among people who have built successful societies. So we are doing, first of all, a terrible thing by encouraging this population explosion. The particular aspect of this fueling of the population explosion that I go into in this most recent video is our AIDS program. America has made it its responsibility to try to make sure that everyone with the HIV virus is given these retroviral drugs so that they can live into old age and so that they can live long enough to reproduce. And the number of AIDS cases keeps going up. The idea of these drugs is that when the viral load is reduced, you are less likely to be infectious with the virus. But the virus keeps spreading, and the numbers of people who carry this virus keep growing. And so this too contributes not only to the population boom, but it contributes to the aspect of the population that is so reckless as to engage in all of the dangerous and often exploitative behaviors that tend to propagate this HIV virus that leads to AIDS. So we are doing a terrible thing by, first of all, fueling a population explosion. And then the second terrible thing we're doing, certainly in Europe and in the United States up until recently, is accepting this excess population of Africans that is streaming out of their stricken continent and then trying to find refuge in the only parts of the world that will take them in. And when I say the only parts of the world, what I mean by that is white countries. You don't have African refugees swarming into China or Japan or Korea. You don't have that because East Asians still have a sense of healthy peoplehood, and they would recoil at the idea of taking in hundreds of thousands of Africans. It's only white nations where this is even something that is conceivable. And so, on the one hand, white countries must stop fueling the population growth. Our main export to Africa should be birth control. Our major form of aid to Black Africa should be birth control. And then at the same time, the excess population of Africa must be prevented from coming into white countries. Those are two absolutely essential things that we must do in order to ensure our own survival. So yes, you're correct that Europe faces a potentially mortal threat of being overrun by this huge explosion of growth in black populations. There are still countries in black Africa where a woman has an average of 6 children. 6 children. Most of white countries, you don't have even 2 children. White people are not reproducing themselves. This is another one of the great failings of our people at the current time in history. We have to again reawaken a sense of obligation towards the continuation of their own people among whites, so that white people marry, have children, large families. This has to be the rule among our people rather than the exception today. But so, yes, from that point of view, Europe faces a terrible, terrible threat that is not sufficiently well recognized.
Absolutely. So there you go, boys. You heard it here from the great Jared Taylor. Make white babies. And I am happy to inform you, Mr. Taylor, that we found out today that my wife is pregnant. So
wonderful, wonderful.
We
Congratulations. I will tell you one thing. I have a number of regrets in my life, but my greatest regret is that I have only 2 children. I think 5 would have been a good number. 2 is just not enough. Having children is the most wonderful thing. And being a father is, in terms of just the emotional satisfaction of the experience, it is the great achievement of my life. So congratulations to you and to your wife.
Thank you very much, sir. But you are absolutely correct. I used to, as a young man of 27, used to believe. I was part of a movement that believed in the inevitable collapse of South Africa, etc. And I said I would never get married, and that's why we. That's what I'm talking about when we're talking about reinvigorating a spirit of conquest. I we have to get our young people to have more children so that they can demand more from life, so that they can be the ones demanding, because right now we've got the people that deserve, that are the most undeserving, that demand the most. Okay, so
Yes, yes.
let's
Well,
continue on to the sorry.
well, just one final point. The fact that white people all around the world are not reproducing themselves, and then at the same time, they are encouraging the most fecund, fertile population on the planet. That is to say, sub-Saharan blacks. This is like rearing up armies of enemy invaders to fight against who will fight against their own children. It is a spectacular form of suicide, and white people must be shaken loose from that kind of terrible behavior. And I am optimistic enough to think that this new administration in the United States is going to completely re-examine the foreign aid structure of the United States. At least there's the possibility of that this can happen, whereas such a possibility would have been unthinkable under a democratic government. But yes, please, let's please move on.
Absolutely, sir. Let's have you correct in saying so. Number 5. I have recently rewatched your presentation called "Breaking the Most Destructive Taboo," which is basically a lesson on IQ differences between the races. Could you give us a brief summary of these IQ differences and their consequences for viewers who may not understand this concept of genetic IQ and how it affects the world at large?
Well, the whole question of race differences in intelligence is one that has been taboo in the United States for many decades. I understand that in Europe it is even more taboo. Of course, in the United States, we pioneered this idea that race is not even a legitimate biological phenomenon, that it's some kind of sociological optical illusion. And as I say, the idea that race doesn't exist, that it exists only in your mind, is something that is so wrong and so stupid that only very intelligent people could persuade themselves that it's possibly true. This is utterly, utterly cuckoo. You can tell at a glance. Someone who is 6 months old can tell at a glance that an Eskimo and an Australian Aborigine are obviously spectacularly different. And it's not as though a 6-month-old has been taught social concepts. This is such an insane idea that I'm glad to say that it's gradually disappearing, even in the United States, which is its homeland. But there are many important racial differences, and skin color is only a very superficial and unimportant difference. One of the aspects of human personality that is the one best studied aspect is intelligence. People have been fascinated by intelligence and differences in intelligence within populations for hundreds of years. And we now know that intelligence is a quality that is largely heritable. It is a largely genetic phenomenon. You are lucky to have inherited good genes from your parents, and that is the main reason you are intelligent. It is not as though environment plays no role, but the most important role is played by your genetic inheritance. In the United States, the IQ differences between blacks and whites on average has been 15 points. This has been true for over 100 years. Large-scale IQ testing first began in the United States at the time of the First World War. And the idea was that here you had millions of men, and the US Army had to decide who were the men that they should assign to jobs that required the highest intelligence. It was a kind of a sorting process. And if you took the Army Alpha exam, if you scored high, then you were given jobs of leadership or jobs of analysis where you had to have brains. So this is something that's been going on for 100 years, this intelligence testing, and the racial gap between blacks and whites has been consistently 15 points. What this means is that half of the white population has an IQ of over 100 because that's the white average. If blacks have an average IQ of 85, it means only 16% of the American black population has an IQ over 100. There are some very smart blacks. It's just that there are very, very few of them. And on a per capita basis, whites are 15 times more likely to have an IQ of 130 or greater than a black. And it is those people with the high IQs are the ones who have the most productive jobs, who have the greatest influence on society, those who contribute the most. And it is those at the bottom end of the IQ curve, those of 75 or below, who are a great drag on the population. IQ differences are also reflected in likelihood to be poor, likelihood to be a criminal, likelihood to be a drug addict, all of these things. So a low IQ population is a terrible burden to a society. In the United States, despite these obvious and extremely significant differences between average IQ and the portion of the population that is on the contributing end, the creative end of the population bell curve, despite these obvious differences, it has been obligatory to assume that black people are just as smart and hardworking on the average as white people. And a corollary of this is if blacks do not achieve the same level as whites, this can be due to only one thing, and that is to discrimination and oppression on the part of white people. Now, 50, 60 years ago, there were laws in place that segregated blacks, and they had a hard time getting equivalent education. But today, any difference in achievement between blacks and whites is going to be something that can be overwhelmingly attributed to these differences in ability. And until white people recognize this, and until white people are prepared to say to black people, look, the fact that you are failing, that you are in jail, that you are on welfare, that you have all these problems in your life, it's not our fault. It's just the way the genetic hands were dealt to people of different races. It's not our problem. We have done a tremendous amount to try to help you people, but you cannot go any higher than your natural talents permit you to go. Until white people are prepared to say this to blacks, then they are always intimidated when someone will say to them, look, the races are equal, so if we are not doing as well, it's your fault because you have oppressed us. Now, I don't know to what extent it is possible in South Africa to say to black people or to explain to black people, look, it's obvious. White people are going to run the country better because we are on average cleverer than black people. And the fact is, in every study that you find, intelligence tends to be correlated with a more moral and ethical approach to life. Smarter people tend to be more fair-minded. And so if you take a population, and in South Africa, the black average IQ is lower than that of American blacks. It's somewhere on the order of 75, 80. You just cannot expect people with that average intelligence to create the kind of industrial modern society that white people build wherever you find them, wherever they are in the world. And so you have to be realistic about what you can expect blacks or whites or Asians or any other group to achieve. So until this taboo is broken, and until this taboo is broken, one of the most important things is that whites will always be intimidated with the idea of pointing to the failures and to the misery of blacks, or in some cases Hispanics, and being told the only reason they do not achieve at the same level as you is because of your wickedness, past, present, and future. So it is not only factually important in terms of understanding the way the world works, but it is psychologically crucial for whites to realize that they are not guilty. They are not the ones who are holding black people down. That wherever you find black people, no matter where they are in the world, they build societies that are equally disorganized, in which you have the same kind of criminal and degenerate behavior. This is part of the nature, unfortunately, that black people have ended up with through different forms of evolution. Now, I hope for the best for blacks. I want black people to be the best possible black people they can be. Here in the United States, I think it is terrible for black people to be living in a society that is still numerically and culturally dominated by whites, in which the message to them is the only reason that you have failed is because of these wicked white people. Black people have to grow up. Black people have to realize that they can go as far as their natural gifts will carry them. And if that realization is possible to them, only if they are living entirely apart from whites, then I believe that is psychologically much healthier for blacks. So they cannot say, oh, that black judge or that police officer, I'm sorry, they won't say that, well, that white judge or police officer, that white teacher, he oppressed me. No. If they have black judges, black teachers, black police officers, black legislators, everything black, then they have no excuses. Then they have to realize that their destiny is entirely in their hands. I believe that is the only way that black people can move forward. And so I've been saying for many years that the solution to the American racial problem, and I believe to all racial problems everywhere in the world, is separation. A mutually agreed upon going our own way. And I believe that white people can be psychologically prepared to say this only when they realize that the society, this mixed race society in which they live, which has been a failure in so many respects, is not due to racism or even weirder, institutional racism or systemic racism. This is magical thinking. What is it about the system that's racist? Name one thing about the system that's racist. This is voodoo. We have to get over this crazy blinding thinking and realize that no, races are different. They build different societies, and that the races will be happier and will really reflect their own heritage and will create their own destiny when they are separated.
Absolutely a stellar answer, Mr. Taylor. I would say that maybe, as much as black people need to grow up and take accountability, I think it's white people also have to grow up and realize that black people are not their responsibility.
Yes.
It's not our responsibility to fix.
You're absolutely right. We have to grow up just as much as, and in fact, I believe that we have prevented black people from growing up by constantly telling them, no, it's not your fault. It's the fault of those white people. We maintain blacks in a kind of childish, silly state of mind in which they're incapable of taking responsibility. And the odd thing is that it is in the United States the blacks upon whom white society has lavished the greatest benefits, sent them to the best schools, given them scholarships or bursaries, as you call them, given them the best possible jobs. They are the ones who resent us and who complain the loudest. It is the ordinary black person in the street who is much less likely to think, oh my gosh, the white man is constantly oppressing me. They don't see any white men in their lives. All they ever see is other black people who are not very nice to them very frequently. It's the most privileged, coddled, and most adored blacks who hate us the most. Of course, that's sort of a natural phenomenon, human phenomenon, I suppose. If people keep giving you things you, at some level, you know you don't deserve, you can't help but despise them. But all of this really, as you correctly point out, can be laid at the feet of white people who themselves refuse to grow up. Thank you for making that point.
Absolutely, Mr. Taylor. So I'm going to give you the last question. It's quite a wordy one. And then when we're done with that one, I just want to, there's this perplexing phenomenon here in South Africa, a town called Pringle Bay. They've got this infestation of baboons, and I would like you to give them maybe possible suggestions as to what they could do, to fix this menacing baboon problem that they have. After we're done with the next question. So, Mr. Taylor, we are sure that you are aware that South Africa used to be a sovereign white nation. And in 1994, South Africans accepted a multiracial South Africa that would pursue non-racialism. This is a buzzword in South Africa, constantly non-racialism, which people would understand what that means. But they did this to avoid conflict. Now, this has become part of a spiritual decline among white South Africans, where they would abandon their language and their identity to better fit into the private sector, which supposedly has English as its vernacular. They are less hopeful for a future and increasingly expect less for themselves to cater for the demands of the so called majority. The private sector also seeks to replace government services, but not government itself. And this leads to a double tax situation. Worth noting is that the private sector uses BBBEE, broad based black economic empowerment, to ensure the economy stays in the hands of the black majority. White people have accepted this premise to avoid upsetting black fragility. Given the above statement, do you think it is time for white people to start demanding more from the future? For instance, are we ready to demand white exclusivity in our countries?
Well, in a word, of course, yes. But as I suggested earlier, you face unique problems. Uh, and again, I'm flattered that you should seek my advice or my opinion on these problems. But you are the ones who know best how you will have to proceed. In the United States, we instituted what we call affirmative action or racial preferences that advantage non-whites over whites, even recent immigrants. Some Mexican who has hopped the border already can benefit, or at least used to be able to benefit, from racial preferences in his favor over a white person who's been here for generations. Now, this is something that you did not face until blacks became the majority. In that sense, you have a very clear idea of where this idea came from, who brought it on, and whose ideas must be defeated in order to move forward. In the United States, it was more difficult because government instituted this kind of disempowerment, this kind of discrimination against whites, which wasn't so bad insofar as the main beneficiaries of this discriminatory policy were blacks, who were maybe 12%, 13% of the population. Of course, now that we have 18% of the population being Hispanic, they benefit from it too. American Indians, Eskimos, whoever you want to call them, all of these people also benefit from them. East Asians even, sometimes to a certain degree. But at least this happened in the United States while we were still a majority. And so it was very confusing for white people. They saw these preferences and they thought, well, wait a minute, what's going on here? Well, at least the president's white, most of the senators are white, most of the representatives are white, the judges are white. And I guess this is just the way it has to be. You have a much clearer picture of no, you know exactly why this is happening, because power is in the hands of black people, and black people will use that power ruthlessly and relentlessly for their own advantage. How to end this? It seems to me that the way to end black economic empowerment is that will be a byproduct of something that is much more fundamental and much more important, and that is establishing some kind of white, local, if need be, national, preferably, some kind of some kind of white autonomy. Now, in the United States, I think in terms of local autonomy, overcoming these laws that ban or that require racial integration, for example. I believe that progressively in the United States, we can develop local areas in which a much healthier attitude towards race can be established. And perhaps gradually we can develop areas which can become sovereign, which can become even perhaps detached from the United States. As I said before, so long as more people agree with us, we will find solutions to this problem and we will ensure that we survive. The South African case is a much more difficult one. You mentioned Orania earlier. I understand that Orania has a waiting list. There are many people who are trying to get into Orania, but it's one small area. I understand that there are gated communities in South Africa as well that are effectively all white. But these are such small areas And in the case of Orania, you have to be approved. It's a process to get in, and it's out in the middle of an inhospitable part of the country. It has to be the case that if you are to have some kind of autonomy, even if it begins locally, you have to have areas where there is a white majority, in which there is a white power, some kind of a localized or eventually generalized white power. How you achieve that will be a remarkable achievement when it happens, but I'm afraid I'm not in a position, much as I'm concerned about the future of the Afrikaner people, I'm not in a position to give you advice on a problem that is different and more daunting than the ones that whites face elsewhere all around the world.
Absolutely, Mr. Tyler. Yet again, very good answer. So, the reason why we bring this up is because white people in South Africa have formulated what I believe the wrong direction for the future. Now, a lot of young men are very ill versed in our history and the intricacies of our politics. So a lot of the solutions that they come up with are not so much authentic, and they are not so authentic in their thinking as they would like to believe, but rather they regurgitate pre-packed solutions. Now, there's this great little book. It's called Die Goeie Hoop Plan vir Suid-Afrika. Now, this is an extremely important read for anybody that is concerned with the South African political landscape. In this book, it details a summary of what was said at Congress that was held on the 12th of November in 1981, in which they discussed the future of South Africa. At that time, it's worth noting that South Africa only had 4 provinces. They said that in the future it will have 8. Today, we have 9 provinces. So it's very clearly, if you look at this little book, that the model that is being followed for South Africa is followed from the discussions that took place on that day. And what they said on that day is that in the future, the state sector and the private sector must work more closely together to achieve a South Africa that works for all. Now, usually when you hear the sentiment that we need to achieve a solution that works for all, it more often than not doesn't work for white people. So
yes,
what we are witnessing in South Africa is a takeover of the state by the private sector. And this is a very dangerous thing. So many people come out in support of the private sector, saying things such as, South Africa is not in a bad position because we have privatized healthcare, we can privatize security, we can privatize the economy, we can privatize not only healthcare, even electricity is something that they want to privatize. Now, what I know, being politically active from a very young age, is that, for instance, the minister that was in control of railway system in South Africa prior to the handover bought himself, I think it was 1,500 trucks. And then when the handover took place, they destroyed the railway infrastructure, putting the power into the private sector's hands. So now you're sitting with a situation where you've still got the federal government, because they are aiming to move us towards a federalist system that taxes us for the public transportation and railway systems, even though it's non-existent and it's completely in shambles. But you also have to pay for the services that private companies provide.
Well, I know that there is a sentiment in South Africa that the private sector has been able to make a bearable life for white South Africans, sort of in the crevices, in the interstices, here you have the public sector with its terrible public services, its bad taxation, all of this awful stuff. But then white entrepreneurs have kind of worked in between all of these awful things. And so you have these islands of a certain amount of prosperity and success among whites. Now, we have a much smaller scale example of this, and that is when the public schools were forced to integrate in the United States. Many whites left, and so they sent their children to private school. So unlike the blacks who went to state-funded schools that we all pay for, white people ended up paying for two school systems. One for the publics, mostly black or Hispanic, and then another private school for their own children. Now, if you multiply this many, many times over, so that for security, for example, or for electricity, or for transportation, all of these things, which should be in the hands of the public sector, but then you have to pay double. Obviously, that is not a tenable situation. Now, it seems to me that you have a tendency to blame the private sector in and of itself. I think that capitalism sees opportunities. Capitalism has no morality one way or the other. And the morality of capitalists will reflect the morality of the people around it. So that, for example, in Japan is a pretty capitalist country. And yet, the large companies in Japan, they may do exploitative things, but they do not go against the instinctive ethos of the Japanese people to maintain Japan as a homeland for the Japanese. So long as basically everyone in the country takes that point of view, then I don't believe that capitalists, no matter what their exploitative view may end up being, they are for the most part going to abide by that, because that's what the society requires. Once society, in the case of South Africa, becomes one in which you say, well, okay, the majority is black, and so we have to do things for the benefit of blacks, then it is entirely possible that the people who run the big companies, they will start going off in horrible directions that are certainly bad for the people, the white people of South Africa. I spent a lot of time studying non-capitalist alternatives, Marxist, socialist economies. They fail for a whole host of reasons. Now, it's true that people who are running big companies, they have a tendency to enrich themselves, often at the expense of others. But it's certainly true that in a properly run, patriotic and healthy-minded society, then capitalists become rich only because they provide services that people voluntarily pay for. It's a delicate balancing act. But from then to decide that the solution is for the government to take control of all of these important economic decision-making, that's not a direction in which I would go. Of course, in the case of South Africa, when you have the entire government and when you have private companies that are now run by blacks, and you have a kind of capture of the state agency by these private organizations, then you get the worst kind of combination of black-run private companies in cahoots with a black-run government doing everything that is to the detriment, certainly of whites and often to the country at large. And combine that with the fact that you're dealing with black people who are very seldom public spirited in the way we expect whites to be. And you face the worst of all possible worlds. But again, from this phenomenon that you face, I don't know which way your tendencies are, but I would not be tempted to go towards some kind of government control of the important economic decision making.
Oh, yeah. So my position is that it has to be to the benefit of white people. Now, the only reason why I would say I am an advocate of an economy that is not open for anyone to participate in is that the state has to act as a guardian of national identity. So not in so much that it must control the economy and limit us in who we may do business with, but it must certainly limit who may have interests inside the company. Because inside the country, pardon. Because right now we sit with a situation where the majority we've got more so oligarchy running South Africa, and the majority of these countries are foreign owned. So it's not to the benefit of the Afrikaner people. And we saw in the apartheid government that actually when when there is a healthy state elected, that there can actually be a very, very booming economy that competes with some of the biggest economies in the world. Why I advocate against the private sector here specifically is because I believe there is malicious intent from the private sector to keep South Africa out of the hands of the Afrikaner people. Now, this goes to, it's going to become a very long discussion, so I don't want to take up your time too much, Mr. Taylor, but there was a man named Harry Oppenheimer, and he was the head of the Anglo-American Corporation. As you can see in the book, he is featured there as one of the most prominent speakers, and his family, Nicky Oppenheimer, today the son, is probably still one of the most prominent business people in South Africa, but he's not an Afrikaner. His family is also stated as not even associating with necessarily being white. So they are the ones having the biggest say in what happens with our economy, yet they do not associate themselves with us. Now, what I say, I was into conventional politics, and I'm not going to go too much into that, but one day a very big political figure in South Africa, we had a little debate, and he said to me, Johannes, why are you against gays having equal rights? And my answer to that was simply, and it would apply to this logic as well, if you are not going to contribute to my people naturally by birth, if you can contribute to our people by being one of us, then you also have no right to say what must happen in the future of my children. So that's where I formulate my economic principles from. It must be to the benefit of our people.
Well, yes, that sounds to me not so much an economic principle per se, but one of national fellow feeling, and making sure that the people who are making the economic decisions are those who are genuinely part of your folk, and who are going to be people who are going to have descendants who will be affected by the decisions they're making today. I agree with you that it is an insane situation when in Europe you have prime ministers of countries or chancellor of Germany who are women with no children, for heaven's sake. I think your argument about homosexuals is a legitimate one. These are people who will not have descendants who follow them into the future. Should they really be making decisions for those of us who expect to have descendants 1,000 years from now into the future? Exactly. No. And also, if you have no real emotional or biological connection to the people of the nation, then of course you should not have any kind of important economic decision-making power. What we have in Japan, as I mentioned before, you don't have people of any kind of foreign extraction who are running big companies. You have Japanese. They are overwhelmingly, I don't know of any open homosexual person who is the equivalent of Tim Cook in Apple, an open homosexual who's running a big company. They just don't have that in Japan. I suspect they don't have it in Korea. They don't have it in China. Those people have a much healthier sense of being part of the nation. And when that's the case, then the economic decision making, again, is part of the nation. Now, I see you flashed a picture of baboons.
Yes.
I'm by no means an expert in baboons. I can barely pronounce the name. So I quake at the kind of question you might have for me on the subject of baboons.
Well, Mr. Taylor, I think that we've had a very salient discussion. I don't know if you would agree, but yes. Perhaps you did say we are coming up to an hour and a half, or it's been an hour and a half, just supposed to be an hour and a half. So I don't want to take up your whole day. I was thinking that maybe before we close, we'll have our closing thoughts now. But maybe there's this town in South Africa. It's called Pringle Bay, and there's obviously a lot of liberals that live there, and they've got a big problem with the baboons. So I'm going to show 2 clips, and then I'm gonna ask you if you've maybe got some, good advice, salient advice for the people of Pringle Bay,
All right.
So, okay, the first clip we're gonna play, and then I'm gonna play a second clip, and then you can give your commentary, Mr. Taylor.
All right.
At first glance, it looks like a case of man versus wild. All along the Cape Peninsula, where National Park meets residential areas, baboons are a contentious issue.
They're so habituated. They're raiding houses almost every day at certain times of the year.
While fascinating to watch in the wild and troublesome on the road, having a troop go through your kitchen is another matter. And alpha males can be terrifying.
Once when I was sitting watching television, a big male baboon came in and tried to take fruit off the table, and I managed to chase him out with a stick.
Government-contracted rangers patrol areas where the animals are a problem. The baboons are wary of them because they shoot at them with paintball guns. Animal rights advocates say arming rangers with paintball guns encourages residents to use them recklessly, or worse.
We had a little juvenile found dead in a garden last year with a pellet wound to its chest. So shot point blank in the chest.
A decade ago, a group of residents got together and decided to manage the problem themselves. What they've done is they've erected around their enclave several kilometres of baboon-proof fence. But even that hasn't solved the problem entirely. Raiding males have found a way around the fence. That should mean they can be euthanized. But when that happens, social media lights up.
The animal rights people kicked up so much fuss and put so much pressure on the authorities that the authorities refused to implement that protocol for raiding male.
So until the real conflict between all the interest groups is resolved, the problem remains.
Just the last little clip, yeah. I'm sorry, Mr. Taylor. This is a very pressing, matter.
He's projecting a common baboon behavior on his human cousins, as we learn in the Baboon Britannica.
Baboon is learning to dominate human. The human is actually teaching the baboon by not just keeping walking and holding their line or dropping their food. The human is teaching the baboon that they are submissive. And the baboon is learning that the more it imposes itself spatially on that person, the greater the chances of a reward. Until it gets to the stage where the baboon runs up to the person and even grabs hold of them, shakes them a bit, they drop the food, and then they're getting their rewards. Now the baboon has learned to raid people.
Well, that last clip in particular could be a parable to the susceptibility of white people to intimidation and exploitation by aliens. I think it's almost a perfect parallel. That's one of the crazy things about white people. We can be so easily morally manipulated by people who wish to take advantage of us. As for this question of an invasion by baboons, I suppose it's perhaps because we have a tradition of the Second Amendment and people are very well equipped with guns in the United States. We have a problem with wild pigs, but in those parts of the country where there are wild pigs, some people will say, oh, these little piggies are so cute, but they come around and they uproot your garden and they will sometimes get into where they don't belong and make a terrible mess. Well, you can shoot these swine, literal swine. And a lot of people have developed very good recipes for these boar burgers. Very tasty, very tasty. So my suspicion is that if we had this problem in the United States, people would start developing recipes for baboon burgers. But again, as you say, it's probably the liberals who think that everybody's equal and we can't be guilty of speciesism and we have to open our hearts and open our doors and open our windows, even if it's to our kitchens or bedrooms, for these poor alien baboons who just want a little bit of love and tenderness. But is this an expanding problem, or is it limited just to this one area?
it's an expanding problem. Now, I don't want people to misconstrue what I'm saying, but it is certainly expanding. And I do think that, you did give some good advice. Perhaps on the culinary side, I wouldn't, I wouldn't endorse, making any such claims. But yeah, it is expanding.
I spent nearly a year vagabonding in Europe and North Africa and across the Sahara, and I was in French West Africa, and I did end up eating a certain amount of monkey meat. It's quite flavorful, although I must say that it is a little disconcerting if you're eating a stew and you're stirring your bowl, and what floats by is a little monkey's hand, because their hands look rather like ours under certain circumstances. But it's perhaps because I grew up in Japan, where I ate such things as sea urchins and eels and raw fish, and even a certain kind of poisonous snake called a mamushi. But I'm inclined to eat most anything. But yes, I think, I don't know how much trouble it would be to skin and dress a baboon, just how much meat is on there. But I think that meat on the hoof should not be let to go to waste. In the United States, as you may know, there are people who shoot and skin and stew squirrels. Squirrel au sauce, à la sauce piquante is something of a Cajun recipe. So we don't like to let good protein go to waste. In any case, I think the question here, it's a form of alien immigration, and alien immigration must be taken in hand.
That's a very good answer, Mr. Taylor. A funny story was you would see there's this commentary of the one guy from Tukai, which is a beautiful neighborhood in Cape Town, near to Table Mountain. And I'm sitting there at the doctor's office, and there's this white liberal lady, and we're having a nice discussion. I'm a talkative guy, so we start having a discussion, and she starts telling me about her asylum that she has for the baboons, and she says she's got, I can't remember the name that she had for her pet, and she says, let's say Tarzan. Tarzan was shot by these terrible people. They shot him, and he suffered this grievous wound. And I can't take people that shoot baboons. The people that are so evil and mistreat the baboons, I just can't stand them. And she goes off and on like that. And I said to her, "Oh no, it's interesting. It's interesting." She says, "Now, what do you do for a living?" I said, "No, I'm a farmer." And she said, "Oh, okay, really? What do you farm?" I said, "No, I've got cattle, more like a rancher. I've got cattle, I've got sheep, and I've got game." And she says, "Oh, what's that like?" I said, "No, it's great, but we struggle with we really do have a struggle with the baboons. I would say more so I'm a farmer, but I'm a baboon killer." And it was the most amazing thing to behold. This lady, she was saying very, very aggressive things towards people that shoot baboons. And when I just came out, and put it to her that way, she was completely disarmed, and she didn't have anything. She was so taken aback, she didn't really have anything to say.
Well,
but yeah.
She probably never met anyone who had happily shot a baboon. Now, I do think that it is important to place your shots very carefully. Over the course of many years, I've killed quite a few mammals myself, but every time that I have wounded an animal, I've felt terrible about it. You don't want them to suffer and go off and have some agonizing death. So it's very careful. It's very important to place your shot carefully. One shot is a clean kill. But, I'm sure that lady liberal acquaintance of yours is reeling in her mind to this day, having met a murderer of baboons and one who's not the least bit sheepish about it.
Yeah, no. I must say, to my amazement, we did continue to have a very civil and a nice discussion. But yeah, no, it's true when it comes. Sorry to interrupt, sir, but good moral hunting practices is a very, very. It's a very wide thing. So
it's a very, very important thing. Good moral hunting practices. Just on a closing note, though. Many people in our circle end up cutting themselves off from liberals. And I think it is easy to assume that liberals are wicked people, that they are deliberately working to destroy all that is good and beautiful and civilized and white. Uh, in my experience, that's just not the case. They are deluded. They are our brothers and sisters, and we must work to bring them back into sanity. And for us to succeed, we have to persuade more and more of our deluded brothers and sisters that we are a family that must work together for our own moral ends. Most liberals, I believe, at least the ones who are ordinary people in ordinary life, not the cynical ones like the Hillary and Bill Clintons who go to the top. I believe many of them are cynical and exploitative, but ordinary liberals who vote for the Democrat Party, they really do believe that they are generous and moral and good people. And it is this generosity and morality that I think within our own white nations contributed a great deal to our success, and it contributed to the distinctive institutions that set our civilization apart from every other one. And so we must approach them in, I hate to say a forgiving, but I will use that word, a forgiving state of mind, and try to persuade them that their own survival depends on recognizing the morality of what we are doing. The strange thing about whites is that they have to be persuaded that what they're doing is ethically correct. You can't simply say to whites, well, this is in your interest, the way you can to blacks. You can say, well, this is good for you. And if it's bad for everybody else, who cares? No, you can't approach white people that way. And so even this white lady, it's possible that you, with your eloquence and your goodwill and your sense of humor, with enough time, you might have won her around to a sensible view of race. And that is the idea with which I wish to leave your viewers and your listeners. And thank you very much for inviting me to be a guest on your program.
Thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Taylor. And I think that is such an important point that you make. Probably one of the most profound points that I've ever, or that stuck out for me that you made is this one, because it's important for us to realize that everybody, the entire non-white world's almost aligned against white people. And if we join forces with them in being resentful towards our people who don't get it, then we lose, because then we are strengthening the assault on our people. And my wife was a liberal when I met her. And today, I can promise you, she is everything but a liberal. And one of her sisters the other day was they always, they were very, very on eggshells when I would visit, because I'm very forward about the way that I view the world. In fact, there was a story, they said, my wife's family, they said, are you sure you want to marry Johannes? Because we can't say for sure, but we do think that he might, I know you don't like this term, but just for sake of comedic effect, we do think that he is a little racist, so are you sure? And the next time I go to the home, I said, listen, I would just like to clear the air here. I have been greatly offended. I've never been so offended in my life. I heard that you guys think that I'm a little racist. And they said, oh, no, we didn't mean it that way. I said, no, I insist. I heard you said it. And I must say that I've been working and going out of my way my entire life to be a big one. And now you say I'm only a little one. I feel like I have failed. And all of a sudden they laugh and they find it to be funny. And the next thing you know, they join in. So, we must not abandon hope for our brothers. I love the point that you make about that, Mr. Taylor, and it was a great honor speaking with you. Like I said, if you wouldn't mind just staying in studio after I close this down. Final thoughts from your end?
No, only to once again assert the fact that we are part of a world brotherhood of Europeans. Whether we are Europeans in North America or Africa or Australia or New Zealand or in the home continent, we are all one people, and we all face the same challenges, and we must work together.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Mr. Taylor. And everybody, thank you for joining. Please follow if you don't. I'm pretty sure you are already, but if you don't, please follow Uncle Jared on X. Check out American Renaissance. He really does great work for our people. Support us by following any of the links in the description. And remember, freedom for the white man. We will win. See you guys.